Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I have a follow up to a very popular video I made a few weeks ago, and today I will be theorizing about what if Hercule Poirot was in Miss Marple novels? Could he solve them? And my initial instinct was yes, Poirot could solve these, and probably all of them. That was my initial hypothesis without actually thinking about anything. And Poirot has a wide variety of detective styles that I think put him at an advantage over Miss Marple. He is active. He does have police connections. He's a private detective. He has access to a lot of things Miss Marple simply does not. Yet he also does the Miss Marple thing of, sitting back and thinking and gossiping and realizing the more people talk, the more information they reveal. And like Miss Marple, people underestimate Poirot. They think of him as the funny foreigner, and they think he's harmless. Even when they learn he's a detective, they think that's silly, that's not true, he's really a hairdresser. And where I think Poirot is at a disadvantage to Miss Marple, though, is his Papa Poirot desire to be a guardian for young women and often falling into their trap. And I think the country village setting just isn't Poirot's best. He's often very uncomfortable and out of place there and faces more opposition in those places. Now, the same rules apply. I am inserting Poirot into the story in Miss Marple's place without changing anything. I think a future video in mind would be what would have to change if Poirot was in these stories? How would these stories be different? But in this case, it remains the same exact thing. And obviously, if Poirot were really in these stories, Christie would have had Poirot solve them, and the story structure would have been different to accommodate him. I'm only going through hypotheticals here. This is just a fun exercise. And there will be spoilers, so you can use the chapter titles to skip ahead if need be. And before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. And I'm going to go chronologically through all 12 novels, starting with Murder at the Vicarage. And I think this is an obvious yes. In many ways, Murder at the Vicarage is a slightly different version of The Mysterious Affair at Styles and Death on the Nile and Evil Under the Sun. The murder motive and most of the mechanics are very similar, so I don't see Poirot having any difficulty in solving this murder. This is probably the Miss Marple novel with the most moving parts, mechanics wise, and I think it's right up Poirot's wheelhouse. I don't see any real areas of adversity for him. I don't think he gets sucked in by the likes of Anne Prothero. She's older. She doesn't need Papa Poirot. I think she'd try, but I think she'd fail. And there are a lot of subplots and red herrings here that I think Poirot makes quick work with. I think this largely plays out mostly the same as it did with Miss Marple. Not much really to say here. The body in the library, and this was a tough one. My initial instinct was yes, Poirot would solve this, and that is ultimately where I landed. But it was quite a journey there. First off, I think there's a chance that Poirot would recognize the body in the library as not Ruby Keene. It's tough because keeping everything the same, Poirot wouldn't know who Ruby Keene is when he looks at the body, and he wouldn't know about Pamela Reeves being missing. It's hard to realize that when you don't know what you should be looking for. But then I think to Cat Among the Pigeons, where Poirot noticed something about a certain student's knees, which was weird, but we do know Poirot is something of an expert on young ladies' fashion and beauty habits. This gets brought up a lot in his works, and I think there's a good chance Poirot would at least be suspicious that that body is not what it or who it Josie claims it to be. Now, I do think he gets distracted by Basil Blake, who seems very much in line with the Frank Carters and the James Bentleys, these other young male characters Poirot hated and didn't really want to help, but still, I think he does get there. I mean, the mechanics of the body in the library are complex and seem much more in line with what Poirot is used to compared to later Miss Marples, where there really isn't a lot to investigate. I think Josephine Turner is someone who would try to pull a fast one on Poirot. I don't think he falls for it. I don't think Josie is Poirot's type either. I think he would be turned off by the glitzy glam of the Majestic Hotel and how almost uppity Josie is. She lacks that subtle beauty of a Jane Wilkinson, for example. I don't think it works on Poirot. I also think the bevy of detectives in the story works to Poirot's advantage, where it actually hurt Miss Marple. So I do think Poirot solves this one. The Moving Finger, and this was the one I was least sure about my decision. I did say yes, Poirot would solve this, but to be honest, I feel like this is absolutely the kind of mystery Poirot would have zero interest in. I don't think he cares about poison pen letters in a country village even after Mrs. Symington dies. Remember, nobody thinks anything other than suicide for Mrs. Symington. And we've seen Poirot before, like especially in the short stories, just not take an interest in any crime that wasn't intriguing or serious. I don't think he cares about this at all. Now, the murder of Agnes the maid, I do think, is a potential way in for him, as I think he would at least care about that. And Miss Marple, like Miss Marple, I do think Poirot solves this quickly. That is why I said yes. Poirot may not have any interest in the mystery, but that doesn't mean he couldn't solve it. I think the fact that Elsie Holland didn't get a letter is something he would seize on immediately. Also, this book has a clue with like the typing of the envelopes that's very similar to Clue in the ABC murders, which would have already happened. Poirot did fail to see the significance of it in that book, but this book being later, I don't think he would miss it. Now, I do think Poirot is probably led astray by the letters themselves. I think he's much more likely to believe the letters are true than Miss Marple. Poirot being a man, although he still loves his gossip, he's not at the top of the gossip chain like Miss Marple is. He's not an expert in the art of gossiping. But still, I think this is a good solve for Poirot. It's not that difficult. A murder is announced, and I didn't know about this one. This feels very much out of Poirot's specialty for some reason. It's actually probably closer to the likes of like a Dead Man's Folly, only Poirot is absent for the murder. I do think the murder of Rudy Shirts interests him, so I don't think that's an issue, and I don't think the mechanics or the characters pose any issues for him, especially since the twist ending is one used many times by Christie. So I did say Poirot solves this, but there's just something about this book that feels totally disjointed for a Poirot, and I'm not sure what it is. I think the problem could be like this is a book Poirot would want to be in from the start, but because I'm simply switching him out for Miss Marple, he cannot be, and I don't know, that just feels weird. I think one particular problematic area for Poirot is meeting the different characters. Poirot is not from Chipping Cleghorn, nor could he really fit in. And while Miss Marple is also not from Chipping Cleghorn, she is much better suited to get information out of these people because St. Marymead is similar to Chipping Cleghorn. And I think Poirot faces some resistance from the likes of Miss Murgatroyd and Miss Hinchcliffe and the Easterbrooks. I don't mean like in terms of like him studying their human nature. I mean just from getting information out of them, especially when these people are like skirting the food rationing laws. With Poirot being like a big fancy London detective, I don't think they're as open to him as we saw in Mrs. McGinty's Dead, which is also set in a village where people were very hesitant to help him. They didn't believe Poirot was actually there to solve Mrs. McGinty's death. Now, I don't think any of this actually stops Poirot from learning anything, which is why I think he does solve this. And there's also a decent chance someone like Mitzi, the housekeeper, is much more open to Poirot than she is with Miss Marple. I do think this is sort of a weird one to have Poirot in, but nonetheless, I think he solves it. They do it with mirrors, and I mean, this is an obvious yes. This murder is very simple. I think Poirot has like no trouble with it. And now there is a chance because this is a Poirot that he overcomplicates the plot, whereas Miss Marple would never do something like that. Poirot's arrogance is generally working against him at times, and he often misses the forest for the trees and thinks everything is so much more complicated than it really is. But I don't see, even if he does do that, how he doesn't eventually get there in the end. The mechanics here are very simple. I've often thought this book should have been a short story. I think the murder plot actually has a lot in common with Murder on the Links, with like all these people running around the house everywhere. Specifically the kidnapping plot from Murder on the Links. I don't really have a lot to say, as I often do when it comes to discussing They Do It with Mirrors. There just isn't a lot there. There's not a lot to say. I think Poirot solves this with ease. Onto A Pocket Full of Rye, and no doubt this book is infinitely better with Miss Marple than with Poirot, but I think Poirot would solve this. I think he does it in a totally different way than Miss Marple does. I mean, first of all, I don't think Poirot cares all that much about Gladys. as Miss Marple does. Poirot doesn't train maids. He's definitely more interested in like the Rex Fortescue murder. And we've seen this before, or technically, this book is before the books I'm going to mention, but Gladys is a similar character to like Marlene Tucker from Dead Man's Folly and Joyce Reynolds from Halloween Party, whom Poirot didn't really have a lot of respect for. But what doesn't matter, and that doesn't matter in terms of mechanics, this is very much a puzzly one. This seems very well suited to Poirot, especially when we have like mixed up times of death and lots of lies and like the background research needed. There's a lot here for Poirot to work with. And I think an interesting conundrum for him is how does he prove it? Because Miss Marple solves the story by identifying Lance Fortescue as the killer, but she can't prove it until she gets that photograph from Gladys. However, I don't think Gladys is sending photographs to Poirot, so he needs some other way to prove it, and I don't know where he gets that from. He can solve the murder of Rex, as perpetrated accidentally by Gladys via Lance, but there are no clues about Adele's murder or Gladys's murder. Now, I think Poirot could prove like Lance traveled to England before he said he did, but that doesn't prove anything. So I think Poirot does have issues here, but I mean, this is Poirot. His arrogance and lack of proof isn't going to stop him. He's overconfident when he makes his suggestions sometimes. So I think he probably could finagle something here, but we don't have that great ending like we do in real life. 450 from Paddington is another weird one. When I was doing this exercise, I realized that inserting Poirot into the Marples isn't as seamless as the reverse was. I really struggle to see Poirot using like Lucy Islesborough in the way Miss Marple does, but keeping with the rules, that is, what we will go with. And to be fair, Poirot does do similar things in like the clocks, in which he has someone else report back to him all the information. This is not like Five Little Pigs, where Poirot hears directly from the suspects. This is essentially a game of telephone. I don't think the distance Poirot is from the action is really that much of a hindrance, but I don't see why he would have to be that distant. But anyway, I think Poirot has some key advantages over Miss Marple here. I think he has more resources to track down the identity of the dead woman and is more likely to be believed by, like, the train employees if he vouches for Mrs. McGillicuddy, although I think he's far less likely to believe Mrs. McGillicuddy. But he has some disadvantages as well. If Poirot's presence is noticed in the area, I think that raises alarm bells. Lucy invites Miss Marple to the house at one point. I don't think she could do that with Poirot. It's too suspicious. I don't see why Poirot couldn't solve this one. I think he does, but it's another like really odd one that's very hard to picture him like actually getting involved here. The mirror cracked from side to side, and this is an interesting one because Miss Marple is injured in this one as her age approaches, and Poirot, as we know, also started getting a bit old, but he refused to let that hinder him out of arrogance, not resistance. But again, I think he solves this. I think this is the easiest Christie novel to solve, so I don't see how he doesn't. It would be pretty odd for Poirot, like, not to be invited to the party, since he's a famous detective who gets invited to these things. Although by the 60s, his fame had faded in universe, that is. But I still don't think he has any problems, like, getting information out of guests who were there, especially if he is friends with Dolly Bantry, who is very loose with gossip. I think the more interesting aspect of this book is what does Poirot do in the end? This is the only novel where Miss Marple lets the murderer get away with it, although in this case it's Jason Rudd who goes free after he murders the actual murderer, Marina Gregg. Does Poirot let Jason Rudd get away with it? I think he does for sure. And we know Poirot is a big fan of like the extrajudicial ending and has no problem appointing himself like a judge and jury or even as a godlike figure. But does he cover up what Marina Gregg did? That's the more interesting question for me. I think he would naturally assume he would keep quiet, but Miss Marple does because she doesn't like feel the need to bring all this up in the public eye again. I don't know if Poirot cares about that. Moreover, I'm not sure how Poirot would view Marina Gregg. I don't think he looks at her as sympathetically as Miss Marple does. He certainly wouldn't view the likes of Heather Badcock or Ella Zelinsky or Giuseppe the butler sympathetically. But with Marina Gregg, I think there's the chance he looks at her as a very selfish person, taking the law into her own hands to avenge her loss. Marina Gregg is certainly more sympathetic than her main victim, Heather, but she's not exactly a peach herself. And since Poirot is not a woman and not a mother or a parent, I'm not sure he has the same understanding of Marina Gregg that Miss Marple has. Now, he probably does keep quiet just by virtue of the victims being terrible people as well, but I don't think it's a guarantee. A Caribbean mystery, and I think this is a very easy one for Poirot to solve. I think Christie would have a lot of trouble making this into a full length novel with Poirot, because the thing is, Poirot is far more likely than Miss Marple to have listened to Major Palgrave's story. And we know this because a similar thing happened in Taken at the Flood. Major Palgrave is also more likely to approach Poirot more often, and thus I think the risk of his story being interrupted is limited. I think Palgrave is more likely to show Poirot that photograph once he realizes the man is Tim Kendall. Remember, he sort of like shies away from showing it to Miss Marple, but I think that's probably more because Miss Marple is a woman and he doesn't want to like scare her because he doesn't know Miss Marple like wouldn't be scared by that. But Poirot wouldn't need the likes of Jason Raphael either, I suppose. Poirot could do his own snooping around. We've seen Poirot on vacation a few times, and we know he makes like instant friends with strangers. I don't see any issues there. My guess as to what would happen is Poirot just like wouldn't say anything about Tim Kendall being a murderer until Major Palgrave is murdered, and by that point it's probably too late to save Victoria. But I think Poirot would make quick work of Tim Kendall after that. I mean, I don't think like Lucky Dyson gets murdered. I don't think it goes that far, especially after Major Palgrave dies. Like Poirot would want to like look into it to make sure he's correct, but I don't think it takes him very long at all, especially since he'd be watching Tim Kendall very closely and he would recognize that something weird is going on with Molly. So I think this is like an easy solve here. At Bertram's hotel, and this was an easy yes. The thriller train robbery stuff feels a lot like the early Poirot short stories. I don't think that causes him any problems at all. I actually think Poirot would be onto that one pretty quickly, as he's very sensitive to things like if the hotel had poor service. He would know something is off. And I think the murder plot is also a yes. It's extremely simple. There's not much there. No, I do think there's a very real risk Poirot falls into that distracted Papa Poirot role with Elvira Blake. By the 60s, Poirot had really soured on a lot of those young women. He didn't like Norma Restorick from Third Girl, for instance, but Elvira is a little bit more of like the classic young woman Poirot admires. She's not mature by any means, but there's like a grace to her that and a sympathy to her that I think Poirot could become infatuated with, like he did in like Peril at End House, for instance. I also think there's a chance this could happen with Bess Sedgwick. She also feels more like the kind of woman Poirot might be interested in. And when I say interested in, I don't mean romantically. I mean sort of the trusted friend, guardian sort of role. But the mysteries here are just too simple for Poirot not to solve. There's not really much there. Nemesis, and spoiler alert here for the rest of the video, but this is the only novel I said no for. I don't think Poirot solves this. Now, it's not a hard no, but there are a lot of factors I think at play. None of these really work against Poirot. It's more Poirot is working against them. I struggle with Poirot going on a bus tour of country houses to solve a crime he doesn't even know what it is. It's not that I don't think Poirot would be interested in this. I actually think he would find the challenge intriguing, but the lack of details would anger him. He doesn't like when people withhold information from him. He's the one always going around saying murder isn't a game, and I don't think he would appreciate being put in this situation. And I don't think the money interests him. But I'm still going to go assume he goes on the bus tour. I think something working in his favor is the idea that an innocent man is in prison, and it's another unpleasant innocent man, which seems to happen a lot in Christie, actually. But There are further problems for Poirot. I don't think Poirot stays with the Bradbury Scott sisters, for instance. I mean, first of all, Poirot is unlikely to skip the most physically demanding part of the tour because he's simply too vain to do that. I don't think he would enjoy it, but I don't think he would skip it. And second, the sisters, especially our murderer Clotilde, is unlikely to want Poirot in her house. He's a famous detective. Miss Marple could get away with it, but Poirot cannot. I also don't think like Jason Raphael is someone Poirot would respect. To the contrary, I think Poirot would have hated Jason Raphael in a Caribbean Mystery and would be unlikely to undertake this endeavor to fulfill Mr. Raphael's wish. Even the murder of Miss Temple doesn't seem like the kind of murder that would intrigue Poirot. Now, I do think he would solve this if he had like all the information, but this is really the one instance where I just don't think Poirot could get that information. And even though Poirot's skills mirror and expand upon Miss Marple's, I just think the format of this novel is so well suited for Miss Marple and so poorly suited for Poirot. I think this is a rare Poirot failure, mostly from lack of motivation and desire on his part, but there are other elements at play. Like, I think if Poirot really tried and really was interested in this, I think he could do it, but I just don't think he would be that interested, to be honest. And our final novel here is Sleeping Murder, which I do think Poirot solves. This one is very well suited for Miss Marple, and much less so for Poirot, but there's still enough for Poirot there, especially since we have like the likes of Gwenda Reed here, who is someone Poirot absolutely would want to help, and he has a lot of experience looking to like the past. I think the murder mechanics very much are in Poirot's line. I don't think Dr. Kennedy presents any true danger to Poirot in terms of him being a detective and Kennedy withholding information because of that. Gwenda and Giles and Miss Marple are very open with Dr. Kennedy about what they're doing, and he doesn't clam up. And Poirot being a detective, I don't think changes that. Dr. Kennedy is very secure and confident that he covered everything up. And I don't think the clues are the type Poirot would overlook. And I think crucially, Poirot is interested in this mystery. I think he would appreciate this phenomenon of Gwenda realizing she's lived in this house before and wondering where the body is. And there's some character work here that is familiar to Poirot. Helen's human nature is very similar to Arlena's in Evil Under the Sun, as these women have like promiscuous reputations that are entirely fabricated by their murderers. And I think this case rings a lot of bells for Poirot, and he easily solves it. And that is it for this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I think there's much more to do with this topic. I still have the standalones to cover, short stories even. Maybe I could do this subject with Tommy and Tuppence. I haven't decided yet. I can get really crazy and speculate if Poirot or Marple could have solved like mysteries written by other authors. I don't want to get too carried away here. Let's not get like too ridiculous, but we'll see. Next week is another viewer suggested video about my top 10 mystery television series of all time. And this was a very tough list to put together. There were so many options and so many shows like I actually haven't seen yet. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.